Today, I want to talk to you about my book, Expose Yourself: How to Take Risks, Question Everything, and Find Yourself. Humor and insights from my life as a stripper. So, this book is probably my favorite of the 4 books that I've published so far. It really encompasses all the things that I'm passionate about. In it, I describe how I became involved in the secular community. I talk about a lot of the parallels between coming out as a non-believer and a stripper, dealing with the stigmas and stereotypes, and also handling the risk that that involves. Depending on your particular situation, coming out as a non-believer is not always really comfortable. So I kind of take on religion in this book, some of those ideas, and that, of course, leads into critical thinking. So I also talk a lot about pseudoscience and how easily we are fooled. So identifying cognitive biases, logical fallacies, and things like that. I have a whole chapter in here on when I was a ghost hunter and how I eventually came to understand my experiences and things like that as more of a product of the way that our brains function and think, as opposed to actual proof of afterlife. So I talk about secular grief in this book also, and a lot of humanism. There was a lot of human experiences that I had as a dancer that I don't think that a lot of people are really aware of, that it isn't just about sex and, boobs and butts, like I talked about in my previous video. There's a lot of real human connection that happens there. And so I talk a lot about that in this book. So the chapter I would like to read to you today is about seeking knowledge. And it is chapter 7, Eat the Apple, I Dare You. Once upon a time, actually the first time ever, there was a lush and beautiful garden. This garden and the entire world were created by a powerful being. This being, having created and designed everything in the world and the universe beyond, knows everything, past, present, and future. The only being in existence, we'll call him Jim, was lonely. Jim decided he would make another being just like him to keep him company and to care for this paradise he had made. He gathered up a handful of dirt and made a man we'll call Brad. Brad's first task was to name the other life forms, called animals, that Jim had made. He was brought each one and gave it a name, and although he had been made to keep his creator company, Brad was lonely too. So after he fell asleep, Jim took a rib from him and made a companion, a woman. Brad named her Angelina. Now we have 2 people made in our all-knowing, all-powerful being's image, except for one little detail. They were not all-knowing as their creator was. Jim had created many trees with fruits for Brad and Angelina to eat. Diarrhea didn't exist yet. But also put a tree right in the middle of the garden from which Brad and Angelina were forbidden to eat. Jim told them that if they were to eat this fruit, some say it was an apple, from this tree, they would have the knowledge of good and evil and would die. Now, as the first people ever, Brad and Angelina were a little naive, which was exactly the way Jim wanted them to be. One day, while Angelina was collecting fruit, she heard a voice behind her that was neither Jim's nor Brad's. She turned around and saw that it was a snake. This snake was telling her that she should eat from the forbidden tree, and then she would have the same knowledge as Jim. Being the important, ignorant person that she was made to be, she plucked the apple off the tree and brought it back to Brad. They both took a bite, and the shit hit the fan that had yet to be invented. Instantly, they both understood that they had royally fucked up. They took the word of the talking snake that Jim had created. They ate the fruit that Jim had put in the garden specifically so that he could tell them not to eat it. Brad and Angelina saw that they were naked, and that was wrong for some reason not clearly defined. Jim was pissed. He told Brad that his days of freeloading were effectively over and that he would have to work for the rest of his life, which now had a time limit placed on it. As for Angelina, well, she would be doomed to a life of subservience to her counterpart with the penis. Angelina and all the women after her would be cursed to bleed once a month, and with the bleeding to be preceded with irrational cravings for all the foods that would make her fat. She and all the women who came after her would also be cursed to experience excruciating pain during childbirth in addition to unsightly stretch marks. Jim had a knack for creating curses. The snake, it seemed, was also cursed, despite the fact that he appears to have done exactly what he was made to do, tempting Angelina to eat from the fruit of knowledge. Now, the snake would become the grossest animal on earth, second only to the overweight man in the middle of a midlife crisis who can't seem to understand that his money doesn't make him any less sexually repulsive. As a person who has an intense dislike for snakes, I can't help feel, but that snake got railroaded in this whole mess. In addition to creating the universe, earth, and life, Jim also manufactured what we know as original sin. He concocted a plan to make sure that the lives he created would have a reason to fear and obey him. All his creations would now suffer during their earthly lives. But if they choose to love and obey him, he will make sure that they get to go to paradise when they die. Jim made it clear that whether or not you choose to love and accept him in this life, you will suffer, regardless. If you choose to ignore him, you will suffer not only on earth, but also in a fiery realm of eternal torture in your afterlife. Thanks a lot, Jim. Malignant narcissism is a psychological syndrome which includes an extreme mix of self-absorption, antisocial behavior, and sadism. Considering the setup perpetrated on poor Brad, Angelina, and the snake, I think it's safe to call Jim a malignant narcissist. In other words, he's kind of a fucking asshole. And all humankind will now pay for it forever. Out of the 3 victims in our story, Angelina seems to get it the worst. Sure, Brad has to work and toil for a living, and the snake is, well, gross. But Angelina bears most of the responsibility for the fall of man. I'm not saying that this whole thing didn't make it suck for everyone, but I felt my hips move apart as I was giving birth, and that certainly seemed a little worse than planting tomatoes in the garden. As a cursed woman, I am not a huge fan of Jim. Thank Jim for the strip club. One of the first things these unfortunate people learned when they ate the forbidden fruit was that they were naked, and that was bad. When I learned this story in Sunday school, I will have to admit I was more focused on the graham crackers and milk that was provided than the actual meaning of the story. In preparation for this chapter, I read the story again. I was unable to understand why they thought it was wrong to be naked. If the first people were made in God's image, then what is wrong with their bodies? Is it wrong for God to be naked too? What is it about our bodies and genitals that is so wrong in the first place? This story parallels many other religious texts and myths. The common theme in these stories is that women are temptresses. There is the story of Pandora, who refused the warning not to open the jar of evils, thereby bringing an end to the golden age of man. Sirens luring unwitting sailors to their deaths, and even Helen, who is credited with sparking the Trojan War. Women will use their bodies to entice men into doing bad things. The female form itself is apparently so irresistible to men that in some cultures, women must cover up their bodies. The nun's habit and the Muslim hijab are 2 such examples. Are men so weak that they can't see a woman's hair or ankles without going into an uncontrollable, lustful fugue state where they are no longer responsible for their actions? That seems to be the logic at work here, or illogic as the case may be. For that reason, women must be controlled. I shall not suffer a woman to teach is written in the Bible. If a woman were to stand up and teach the Bible, I suppose men would suffer. I know I suffer when anyone teaches the Bible, regardless of which gender they belong to. By putting the responsibility of the fall of man and the original sin on women, some men are willing to use that to their advantage. Since women are lustful creatures who seek to lead men to temptation, it's probably a good idea not to let them have any power. Let's just keep them pregnant and in the kitchen. After all, in the Bible, the word rib was loosely translated. Some say it really meant appendage. And what does an appendage do? Well, it's an extension or tool. It's attached to something, and it is used like a tool. If a woman is made from a man's appendage, then effectively she is his to be used. Not really a separate entity, just an attachment. That makes women more like the pasta attachment that came with my stand mixer, as opposed to the mixer itself. This whole story seems suspiciously like a way to subjugate half the world's population. I wonder what it would have been like if it had been a woman who wrote these stories. Would men then be considered the appendage? I kind of like where that thought is going, but let me get back on track. Religion says sex is shameful. We are supposed to be embarrassed about being naked. Women in particular are supposed to keep their sexuality on the down low. Don't get me wrong, men get their share of guilt and shame too, but for the most part, women aren't bragging about how much dick they get. You are unlikely to hear a woman exaggerate the number of guys she's been with. When someone wants to insult a woman, they will likely use her sexuality as a weapon. She's a slut, or easy, or whatever. If she isn't overtly sexual, then she's frigid. People generally talk about women in terms of their sexual attractiveness. Men get this too, but not close to the same degree. Personally, I'm grateful that nudity is considered taboo. I'm happy that people are embarrassed by sex and overt sexual expression. If they weren't, I might have had to stay in college and become a lawyer. I think my life would have sucked immensely. I likely wouldn't have met my husband, and while I would probably have had a kid, it would have been with someone else's genetic material. I wouldn't be listening to the unique marvel that is our son blasting Iron Maiden from his puberty cage. I wouldn't have been a stripper. Without the guilt and shame our society has about sex and nakedness, I don't think strip clubs would exist at all. You know which people don't really come into the strip club? Nudists. If it was totally normal to see naked humans in an everyday sort of context, I wouldn't have had a job as a nude dancer. If sex was considered just what it is, a normal part of human life, bachelor parties would be terribly boring. Think of poor Ron Jeremy or John Holmes. What would they be doing with their lives? Accountants, maybe? Without the guilt and shame around sex, I don't think we'd have nearly as much sexual assault and abuse. It is a fact that when you try to repress a natural human drive, it comes out in very unhealthy ways. There would still be people who get off on hurting other people. That is a fucked up psychological problem that would exist either way. I believe there is a good portion of people who would not have acted criminally if they had been allowed to express their sexual urges in a sexual way. There's nothing at all wrong with our bodies or how they function. There is, however, a lot of power in keeping people feeling guilty and ignorant about it. Ignorance is not always bliss. In some cases, there are definitely things you don't want to know, and once you do, you are not better off. For instance, cats have barbs on their penises. I didn't need to know that, didn't want to know that, and I'm sorry that I now have that information stored in a part of my brain that is readily accessible. Moving on. For the most part, knowledge itself is power. That public service message in the 80s was right. The more you know, the better off you are. People like Jim want you to be ignorant and feeling guilty. How else is he going to get you to love and obey him? It was apparently too much effort just to be a nice guy and earn your trust and love. It's much easier to control people when you control what they are allowed to learn. The concept of original sin is the act of disobeying God to seek knowledge. Let that sink in. The whole of mankind was doomed to suffer on earth for disobeying a narcissist in order to learn about the world he created. Now every person after the first two must prove their love and obedience to an entity who, although capable, refuses to give any hard evidence for his existence. That pretty much guarantees there will be a lot of people punished after they die. And this entity is supposed to love every one of us. Okay. He punishes us for our doubt, yet he created us to seek knowledge. Seems like he set his creations up in order to punish them. That would make him a sadist, in the truest sense of the word. If Jim didn't intend for us to suffer, why plant the tree of knowledge at all? He could have just let his little pets live out their lives in paradise. Why test them at all, if not to punish them? The answer must be that he wanted them to know, and then exert his power to feed his own ego when they disobeyed him. If you evaluate it objectively, this is sick and demented behavior. In our lives, we are encouraged to learn about the world. In school, math, science, history, and literature are all subjects we study to get a better sense of the environment in which we will live. That knowledge is intended to help us live better and more productive lives. Would we be better off if we just didn't learn? If we got our information solely through ancient religious texts? As a species, the more we have learned about our world, the more we have advanced. Well, there has been some knowledge that has made our world more dangerous, like weapons of mass destruction. For the most part, we've made our lives better. Modern medicine, food production, and this little computer I'm typing on have all come from our quest for knowledge. When we as people failed to question and simply lived through the stories of other people, advancement stopped. People died of the plague, and the ones who dared to question authority were executed. Put in that context, learning is pretty fucking important. There is an inherent uncomfortableness that comes when we don't have satisfactory answers to profound questions. That's when people tend to want to fill the gap. The easiest way to fill that gap is to simply make shit up. Enter myth and religion. As a way to get a message across, stories are fun and effective. The Boy Who Cried Wolf, for example, is a great way to get someone to understand that telling bullshit stories is a good way to get eaten by a wolf. When you make shit up and then threaten somebody with death or eternal damnation if they question it, that's when our gap filler becomes dangerous and hurtful. We are born curious, and in times when our knowledge is severely lacking, myths and tall tales were a good way to explain things. As we learn the truth through observation in the scientific method, we need to drop those primitive explanations. Hanging on to outdated information because you don't like what the actual evidence tells us is problematic. The scientific method of asking questions and learning through objective evidence can tell us things that do not always coincide with what we thought we knew, and that is a good thing. Being able to question what we think we know and then changing those ideas and opinions based on new evidence is how we move forward and solve problems. Imagine if scientists had rejected the discovery of antibiotics because it didn't mesh with the treatment of bloodletting. There would be a lot fewer people in the world. Don't tell my husband or my kid, but I'm not always right. That is actually a very good thing, because I have been very wrong on some important things. I spent the latter part of my childhood in a small foothill town. Homeopathy was a big thing at the time. I listened to the spiel from the heavily patchouled lady at our local health food store, and it made sense to me. I bought too much stuff that I couldn't afford and thought I was making great choices. Silly doctors, what do they know? I was so convinced of the effectiveness of these concoctions that in high school I decided to do a report on it. I studied the peer-reviewed scientific studies on homeopathic medicine. Boy, was I ever wrong. I mean, really wrong. It was all garbage. My report did not turn out to be what I intended, but I learned a valuable lesson, and I got an A. We need to ask questions and seek knowledge about our world, even if it's inconvenient. We are curious for a reason, and that reason is to advance our species. Our brains have evolved to fit that very purpose. Our ability to question and reject silly stories is what got us to where we are, for better or worse. Imagine if we all decided to eat from the tree of knowledge. If we all chose collectively, as a united force, to look at facts and reject the people who tell us to stop asking. If we took a stand to reject people trying to control us by controlling what we learn and simply learned for ourselves, what a world we would have. There's a huge difference between science and the stories of myth and religion when it comes to asking questions and gaining answers. In religion, they try to fit the answers they already have to the questions. In science, they ask the questions and look at the evidence for answers, even if what they find isn't what they hoped for. If a scientist gets an answer he doesn't like, he or she does more research and eventually accepts the results. If religion gets a question they can't answer, they tell you to stop asking questions and just have faith. So basically, just trust Jim, the malignant narcissist. The tree of knowledge is all around us, and you don't need a talking snake to tell you to eat from it. The more you know, and the more comfortable you can be with the fact that you may not always find the answers you want, the happier you will ultimately be. Don't be afraid to seek knowledge. Eat the apple. I double dog dare you. So that was obviously my own interpretation of Adam and Eve. And like I said, this book really encompasses a lot of different topics that are going to be relevant to the secular and skeptic community. But, you know, there's lots of puns and sex jokes and a couple of stripper stories in there too. If you are interested in the whole thing, it is available for print, actually in paperback and hardcover, ebook, and Audible. I will have the links in the description. And until next time, I'll see you later.